not just an environmental impact. Sorry, but it's if these EVs and solar panels were made in the United States, they would have a much greener. They would have a smaller carbon footprint, but that would also make them more expensive. So China manipulates. They can use coal for cheap, make all this stuff for cheap, or cut the Americans out of the market, and so then you don't get that advantage.
The macroeconomic policy of the US has changed pretty dramatically since about 2017, precisely to address those issues. Now, we have the broader trade issues, and then we have the climate specific ones. And so maybe we can parse those out for a minute. The broader issues of subsidizing production for export and then dumping that production in export markets and bankrupting the local competition is a tactic that China engaged in for a long time, and the world finally caught on to. And the real shift was around the time Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, and then took office in January 2017 and basically immediately declared a trade war on China. Now, the irony is that despite all the flailing that he did and the bluster and some actions that were misplaced, it actually did align with a shift in broader policy thinking to recognize that China was abusing these global markets, and measures were needed to protect against that. Trade measures, investment in repowering local manufacturing and local supply chains. And that has actually been turbocharged now under the Biden presidency. And the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the giant bill, the value of which is somewhere between 700 billion and $1 trillion, that was adopted in summer of 2022, it includes a lot of these onshoring of supply chains and manufacturing for the green technologies that it's promoting. And so things like batteries only give the full subsidy to electric cars if they are made in the US or extracting um, critical minerals in the US or in certain allied countries. And so that is actually being tackled now. And there are a lot of trade issues around solar panels, and so it's recognized that those are not fair tactics for global economic competition, and they have bad consequences, right? I mean, the hollowing out of Middle America and manufacturing was due in no small measure to China's entry to the WTO. And so that was only clear in retrospect, and the Washington consensus of pure neoliberal trade really failed because it was being abused.
I feel like I could have told you that in the 90s.
But so that's
and you would have been right.
Point. But you're making a great point. This is a case where the U.S. can actually pressure China to commit to more green energy because, like you said, with the EV batteries things, like if the U.S. is actually applying pressure to China rather than giving China things to, in the hopes that they will make good on their agreements. So maybe that is how we should be looking at this. What are some of the things the U.S. can do to put pressure on China to actually commit to tackling the climate crisis, which they have a big hand in?
Great point. And I was a little glib when I said that the multilateral climate negotiations basically have no teeth, right? That is largely true. But there are a few mechanisms for influencing countries, large and small. One is simply the moral suasion argument, right? That you're going to look bad in the jury of your peers if you don't take action on this, right? So there's no actual hard power mechanism. It's a soft power thing where you look bad and you lose prestige globally. And one can scoff at that, but I think that that's actually not negligible. It might not be a strong force, but it is a real force, right? It's a factor. People care how they're perceived, and it affects your soft power and your influence globally. I think there's also the question of how everyone else reacts, right? Do we as a global community punish people, even reputationally, if they don't deliver on these commitments? And the answer right now is no, not really, right? You can be Dubai and have a huge oil and gas industry and still host the COP and be lauded for it. So there's that element. And then there are actual policy and diplomatic levers to try to create some real consequences for non-action, right, or bad action. And those can include things like trade measures. So you might be you might face tariffs or not get certain trade benefits if you don't uphold your part of the bargain. People have talked about developing these diplomatic international quote unquote clubs, where if you join the club by committing to climate action, then you are entitled to certain technology and trade that other people who don't commit to those actions and deliver and join the club do not get, right? And that has been proposed, I think, pretty compellingly as something that doesn't necessarily force people to do stuff, but if they don't do it, they're not going to get some other carrot that they would want, right? And then you have much more aggressive international sanctions, right? And so those are usually used for bad actors in the political sphere, right? Maybe if you invade your neighbor or do something really nasty, kill your own population, what have you, you might get hit with international sanctions. There's no reason why we couldn't use those tools to achieve our climate goals. The problem is even the quote unquote good guys don't necessarily have such a great story to tell and aren't necessarily doing that much better than the bad guys. And so, because it's such a muddy space in terms of who's actually doing their homework and not saying the dog ate their homework, I think those tools have not been used because no one really is getting an A and is the teacher's pet.
Right. I mean, how important is China in this supply chain for renewables?
Enormous, enormous. Now there are different types of renewables. There are solar panels, there are wind turbines, there are batteries, there are the components of those different technologies, there's electric vehicles, there's the raw materials and the supply chain and the processing of those raw materials. Those are all part and parcel of the clean energy economy. And China's role in those varies depending on which of those particular things you look at. But overwhelmingly across that whole spectrum, China is the dominant supplier or manufacturer or um, provider of primary or processed raw material, such that they have a stranglehold on many of these technologies globally, both the supply chains and often the end products. Some of that is so, and that by stranglehold I mean often from 60% to upwards of 95% of the market. Very, very large majorities to almost complete monopolies in a lot of these categories. In some cases, one could argue that uh, China's efforts have been completely above board, that they invested 20 years ago tens of billions of dollars in electric vehicles, in batteries, in green energy, and they are reaping the benefits of that farsightedness.
They actually stole a lot of American intellectual property for most of that. So I don't know how much they invested.
there's also the fact that they've gotten subsidies from government, sometimes in contravention of WTO rules, that and engaged in dumping, as we were already talking about, of subsidized products on other markets. There's also the fact that for many decades, one might argue, they're still doing it. China has basically ignored the local environmental consequences of this kind of manufacturing and processing, such that where these critical minerals are mined, they're leached using these horrible acids, and it looks like a moonscape, where they're mined, and people are getting cancer and all these things. And China never really adopted environmental regulations that address that, unlike other
Right.
countries.
And I think that's a really important point because, with all the focus on global warming, right, with this broad global carbon and to a degree methane emissions, sometimes you kind of lose focus on like these horrible things that are happening at the local level. And there's way more to the environment than just global temperature.